Professor Biagini, if you're happy, you can take us away.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar on the future of the island of Ireland. The webinar is sponsored by Sydney Sussex College and the Centre for Geopolitics, to which we are very grateful for the continued support over many weeks for one of the most successful seminars, I think, webinars in Cambridge. And it is a great privilege to have among us Lord Eames, former Archbishop of Armagh. But before going into further details, I'll pass it on to Barry to make the formal introductions and to start the seminar, the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugenio. Before I take the great pleasure of welcoming Lord Eames to our seminar, the 13th in this series, I just want to make a quick remark that we were just discussing before starting that this meeting comes less than a week following the death of the great Austin Currie. And Austin served with distinction as MP for East Tyrone and TD for Dublin West, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, through to his retirement in 2002, I believe. Austin made an enormously positive contribution to life on the island of Ireland, and he was a truly talented and fearless politician. And I know he was known to many of you on the call, and people like Austin built the foundations that we're trying to kind of use now to build a better Ireland and to think positively about the future of life on the island of Ireland. And I guess just to say that we'll dedicate the event this evening to Austin's memory, and our thoughts are with his family. Now, our speaker tonight, Lord Robin Eames, will be known to many of you. Lord Eames is an Anglican bishop who served as Primate of all Ireland and Archbishop of Armagh from 1986 through 2006, during some of the darkest days of the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland, through to the earliest days of the peace following the Good Friday Agreement. Lord Eames studied law at Queen's University Belfast, and after a legal research post, qualified for a PhD and an honorary doctorate in law. He went on to study theology at Trinity College Dublin before being ordained in 1963. He was appointed Bishop of Derry and Raphoe in 1975 and translated as Bishop of Down and Dromore in 1980. He was elected Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland in 1986. He's been a member of the House of Lords since 1995 and sits as a crossbencher. Lord Eames is married to Lady Christine, and they have 2 sons and 7 grandchildren. I also discovered just in our discussion before that Lord Eames remains a keen rugby fan and a retired rugby player. Lord Eames is going to be in conversation with our own Professor Eugenio Biagini, the Professor of Contemporary History here at Cambridge at Sydney Sussex College. As always, my last remark in terms of format, Lord Eames is going to intervene for between 0 and 10 minutes. This will be followed by a discussion for about 20 minutes with Professor Biagini. Then this will allow up to half an hour for questions and answers. So those in attendance, please use the time during Robin and Eugenio's interventions to think up of questions and place them in the questions and answers box. As always, please keep questions as concise as possible, and also mention an affiliation if you have one and if you think it is relevant. Without further ado, Lord Eames, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your welcome, and may I say at the outset, it's a great privilege to be part of this process. I'm delighted that you made a reference to one of the real heroes of the Northern Ireland political scene. What he did in forming the SDLP, and above all in his work for reconciliation at a time of real darkness for Northern Ireland, was remarkable, and I'm delighted you referred to his passing. May God be with his family. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know enough, I think, from the introduction to know that I'm approaching this subject from the experience of church life, the experience of spiritual service and leadership, and the experience of trying to bring what reconciliation could lie in my power, in my web, to bring some sort of sense of reconciliation to the Ireland of the present. The years that we've passed through in the Troubles, and I sometimes smile to myself when we think of that title, The Troubles, and I think of all that went through and went past in my experience, for I am a hands-on person It may be that you have a title and that you have got an official office in the church, but to me it is, and always was, and I hope always will be, person to person that interests me. The years that I served as a bishop, starting off in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday in Derry, and all that that meant for the two communities, were to give me the opportunity to take with me to the other posts that I was asked to occupy a real sense of patient listening. I found that one of the secrets of any progress in reconciliation is to be a listener before you say something. On the day of my consecration as a bishop, I invited Edward Daly, who was then the Roman Catholic Bishop of Derry and within a few years of my own age, to walk with me in the Anglican Cathedral. Now, historians tell me that that was a first off, and yet it began the series of friendships, the close working together and the sharing that we did in those days in Derry. It was to stand, I think, to the strength of both of our ministries that we were able to speak in public as friends, people who were experiencing the same problems, the same difficulties, and yet to be unashamed to say, we differ on this, or we take a different view on that. The reason I'm mentioning that in those early days of my ministry were to prove that listening doesn't necessarily mean agreement. And the history of Northern Ireland in my lifetime has often been to question what I've just said. Listening does not always mean agreement, but the listening has got to take place. And the listening has got to be a part of that process. When I think of the experience of pastoral ministry during the Troubles, I'm convinced again of the importance of that formula. So many families that I knew who had come across terrible tragedies, the loss of loved ones, the bitterness, and in cases, the hatred that was shown one to another, is something that has geared so much of my contribution to Northern Ireland and to Ireland at the present. So what does that say to me about the future? It reminds me, first of all, that we're talking mostly about a generation that is growing up not having embittered themselves by the experience of the darkest days. They've got a future. And they're subject now to Brexit. They're subject to an Ireland that is thinking in different ways in many instances, but they're hearing in history what others have gone through. And they're asking questions of the like of me as, well, what was it all about? What is it likely to be for our future? And reconciliation is at the root of this. It's reconciliation between two governments, the government of the United Kingdom, the government of the Republic of Ireland. It's reconciliation between people within Northern Ireland, the Roman Catholic side, the so-called Protestant side, the nationalist side, the unionist side. How do you reconcile them? Listening, but not necessarily agreeing. How do you bridge that? And that's where the church comes in. I'm a total ecumenist. I have no problem whatsoever in reaching out the same hands that I reached out to Edward Daly all those years ago. I want to listen, I want to understand, but I don't necessarily expect everyone to agree. The Ireland of the future has to be basically an island that listens, an island that looks to the past, but says on its knees, we're not going to let the mistakes of the past jeopardize the opportunities for the future. And so To sum it up, I'm approaching the subject you've given me as one that has experienced the blackness, the darkness, the despair, but has held out a hope that I believe is eternal. And that hope, irrespective of your political outlook, irrespective of your religious label, is an outlook that says the future is there for us to make as people who inhabit the same island. But we're going to listen first, because listening doesn't necessarily mean agreement, but listening can give us the sense of the reality of what we can achieve. And so I suggest tonight that the subject we're looking at, from my point of view, is a religious question, a spiritual question. It's a political issue. But at the end of the day, my plea is, let's start by listening. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lord Eames. Professor Biagini, I know you have some questions prepared.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Robin. This has been, as usual, very perceptive and, in this case, also motivating and moving, what you said. But of course, the situation is not necessarily characterized all the time by people prepared to listen to one another. In fact, in your publications, I'm thinking now of Chains to be Broken in particular, which you published in 92, just before the Downing Street Agreement, you portrayed a society in which listening was very difficult and in which, in fact, animosities were stronger than reason in most cases, or at any rate seems to be the most powerful set of emotions at play. How do you think the situation has changed since then, and especially over the past 3 or 4 years since Brexit?
I think the main change that I've detected has been a growing reluctance to get dragged back into the past. On the fringes of both sides of the argument, if I may call it that, in Northern Ireland, there are those who believe the only way in which they can progress it is to take matters onto the street. And that risk of that happening, the danger of that happening, lurks in the background. But I see in the new generation growing up a reluctance to even do more than hear what happened. There's a new feeling within the field of education that we want to confine a lot of that to the history book. They want to know what the new Europe is like. They want to know what their future would be in the post-Brexit situation. And the worries we've got on health, the worries we've got about hospitals, the worries we've got about the climate, the worries that perhaps my generation would have said, oh, I want to know nothing about that. That issue, those issues are now taking over so much interest for this new generation. I've a great hope that their dimension of their thinking is widening and taking them away from the localization of many of the difficulties and the problems. Now, I'd love to say that's happening. A lot of it is a hope. But I like to feel that the changes we've seen more recently, particularly since Brexit, is compelling us to think of issues which seemed far away before that happened. I know there are division over the success or the failure of Brexit, and I sometimes wonder, did those who voted for Brexit really realize what was going to be implied and what was going to be the consequences of it? Because I think there's a great deal of surprise in some instances what Brexit has in fact meant. And it has driven its own wedge in some ways, understanding between the UK part of Ireland and the Republic part of Ireland. And instances like that make us realize that sometimes by listening to what other people feel and other people's problems and worries, is to understand that there's a lot in common. During the Troubles, I felt that some of the best work that was done was when people in local situations who had animosity towards each other could be brought together when it was pointed out there was an awful lot in common. Because the fears may have different labels, but the uncertainty was there in both instances. And I think that that can be a very important part of reconciliation.
Thank you. Over the past 100 years or so, since partition, the churches, all the churches, played an important role, as you said, the role which they should be playing in moderating animosities, and quite often in bridging the gap between communities, or in preaching to your own flock in a way that would make them more understandable of the other side. But since, of course, the 1990s in particular, the influence of the churches, and particularly the Roman Catholic Church, has declined. And I wonder whether in the present situation, they would be able to play the same role. What do you think? Or is there an area in which in politics, perhaps their influence is still important?
In many ways, what you say is correct. There is a lessening of influence of the structured church, but there is not a lessening of influence of individuals from those churches. I like to think back to an episode in my life which will long remain in my memory, which is what was leading up to what became known as the Downing Street Declaration. John Major was the Prime Minister in London, and Albert Reynolds was the Taoiseach Prime Minister in Dublin. And there was a great movement in those days to try and get some bridge that could bring the two sides together. And I was privileged to be shown the draft that they were talking about, and was asked the simple question, could you or the people that you represent live with this? And immediately it jumped out of the page to me that the one thing that was lacking in that draft was the element of consent. It was not there. And when I said to the two prime ministers, in my honest opinion, unless there is an element of consent written into what you're proposing, you don't have a chance of making this work. Now, to cut a long story short, there was further negotiation, further redrafting, and then the declaration was announced. And because there was a new recognition of the need to consent, there was a chance that it could be an integral part of the peace process, which I believe it became. I'm making this point because I think that in listening to each other, you've got to realize the importance of people consenting to the whole process, not to have something forced upon them, not to have something that they have to get used to rather than instantaneous reaction. And if I have one lesson that I carry from those days of the early years of the peace process, as we call it, it would be that the element of consent has got to be in anything you try to produce. And that can be just as much in a non-political sense between people, as much as between various political and government elements and agencies. And one of the things I think since Brexit has been that people have had to have a heart-searching process of what really is important. What is it we can leave behind? And what is it we can come to terms with? What can we consent to? Because there are a lot of people who, for example, in Northern Ireland, feel the last thing that they want to be is some sort of token that's viewed by Europe on one side, viewed by the remainder of the United Kingdom on the other, some sort of token that can be like a shuttlecock. Northern Ireland can be expedient to some, but in fact for most people who live here and who worry about the consequences of Brexit, there's got to be this process of consent to understand that we have those difficulties, which many in the business community are now experiencing.
Thank you. Besides building consent, as you say, was the crucial part, but besides the consent part of the Downing Street Declaration, another important dimension was trust. And the key step towards building trust was the declaration, within the declaration, that Britain did not have selfish or strategic interests in the area, in Northern Ireland. Is it not the case that the hard line adopted in the negotiations has somehow undermined this claim that Britain does not have a strategic or a selfish interest in Northern Ireland? It's not the case that, in fact, Northern Ireland has become a major strategic pawn in the game of Brexit.
I think undoubtedly that's true. I think that when I work in London and when I meet those who are formulating policy, there is a new recognition that Northern Ireland, whether they like it or not, or find it easy to acknowledge it or not, Northern Ireland is a key issue in this post-Brexit era. And I'm not just talking about the question of protocol and this angle of the whole aspect. I'm talking about the human side of this. I'm talking about the reaction of people in the street, as they say, who are bewildered by much that is emerging over this high-level discussion. And they're beginning to feel they're almost chattels in this high-powered game between the two blocs, Europe and the UK. And I made a plea and will go on making the plea that while you cannot rewrite history, you've got to accept the history of how we came to this point. Rightly or wrongly, we mustn't lose the lessons of what we have come through. And sometimes it worries me when I hear, particularly in London, politicians speaking about the way in which they want to deal with the protocol and the other arrangements between the two islands, so to speak, that they're prepared to lose sight of the lessons of what this part of these islands has come through. And I certainly feel you cannot divide the history of that suffering, the divisions that came as a result of that. And if I may say so, at times the lack of understanding on both sides of the partition border of what the effect of Brexit would be for the people of the northern part of this island.
Thank you. You have such an incredibly long and amazing experience in negotiating reconciliation. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit in the perspective of your experience, also considering South Africa. How do you see the Northern Irish process, especially now that we are entering into a new phase?
One of the privileges of my life has been my friendship with Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And the world knows the wonderful role he played in bringing reconciliation to his country. And I remember comparing notes with him in the build-up to the Truth and Reconciliation Tribunal, which he played such a part in, comparing notes between the problems of division in my country and the problems in his. And he said something to me then that I've never forgotten. He said, no two situations of division are the same. There are divisions in my country because of color. There are divisions in my country because of the heritage that they've come through. He said, in your country, they'll probably say there are divisions by religion. There's divisions that religion has led into political terms. But he said, no two situations of division are the same. The one common denominator is people, in my own life and in my own ministry, I've always remembered that as words of tremendous wisdom from what is now a 90-year-old church statesman. But I'm thinking back to what this means in negotiation terms. I was again brought into the situation of trying to encourage loyalist paramilitaries to cease fire a way back. And I remember pondering often when I looked and listened to their argument and was briefed on the looking and listening going on the Republican side, that all those men had families, all those men had aspirations, totally different, totally opposed, but they were human beings, and they were created in the image of the God that I tried to serve. And when it came to negotiations, when it came to trying to bring together or bring about some lasting peace, it was that drove me, and I know others. People have talked about Austin Curry, and we've remembered him just at the beginning of this program. People of that caliber were people who had emotional sensitivities which drove them on to find not just the other side to understand, but drove them on to find a common level at which we could talk to each other. And if I may say so, that to me is the true meaning of a Christian approach to division, to understand that at the end of the day, you're dealing with people who, in the end of everything, have so much in common.
Thank you. Is there more time for one more question, Barry, before we move to the general discussion, or perhaps it's already 27 past?
Certainly, Professor. No, there's time for at least another question, so fire ahead.
Well, then, just a very brief question. What are the gifts which you regard as essential for leaders in this situation on all sides, politicians, and indeed church people and community leaders?
I think, first of all, a gift to recognize the past, and the gift to realize it doesn't have to repeat itself. Secondly, courage to acknowledge mistakes and failings, and the courage to say, those don't have to be repeated. And thirdly, the courage to believe, not necessarily in yourself, but to believe that there is a higher power which can influence your attitudes and make it worthwhile to go ahead.
Thank you.
I know that sounds such wisdom. I'm almost ashamed to say it.
Thank you.
Professor Bugini, we'll come back to you towards the end of the hour for a wrap up in case you have anything to add. But Lord Eames, what I'm going to do now, I've one or two little things I want to raise within myself. And then there's a number of questions from the audience which I'll put to you. But to the audience, do please continue with your questions. But for my own part, at our meetings, we've often spoken about leadership. And we talk about the likes of Curry, and we talk about the likes of the Humes, and we talk about the likes of the Trimbles and the various characters who were on the scene back when you were Archbishop. And I'm wondering, we often ask our guests to kind of reflect on the extent to which this leadership is still with us. And specifically, I want to, I'm taking my time to try and frame the question because I'm still thinking about it. You were talking about the courage to listen and the courage to engage in dialogue. How can you foster courage in leaders? If there are leaders who seem unable, unwilling to speak and listen, if there seems to be a breakdown in trust, how can that be fostered, or can it? Can we just hope? Do you just have to pray? Do you just have to will it into existence? Or is there something that the public, people like yourself, people like our audience can do to try and precipitate the kind of capacity to listen to one another when it seems to be absent?
I think this brings up the question, Barry, of support. Often true leadership begins with support for what they're saying or putting forward. And then tragically, they may have to go ahead of those who are following and point a different way. If you take David Trimble, David was, in a sense, found his career challenged towards the end because there were those in his community who felt he was stepping too far. Likewise, if I go to the other side and think of John Hume, person for whom I had the highest admiration, John had periods where, in fact, he wondered, were people following his lead? And he therefore had periods of great questioning. So I think leadership in that sense has to have the courage of saying, I may not have the moment that you're accepting what I'm saying, but I believe enough in what I'm saying to believe there will be enough eventually who come round to back what I'm saying. So I think patient listening, again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but patient listening helps you to see the signs and the opportunities of going forward in a particular way.
Lovely. I'm going to put one specific question to you about a very specific thing, Lord Eames, and then I'm going to start picking from some of the questions we've got. And hopefully there'll be time for Professor B, Junior, and myself to come back to you before the hour if we have the time. But I do want to ask about the church service for the centenary of Northern Ireland, which caused such controversy at least in public discourse on the island of Ireland. Can you comment at all about that? Does it tell us anything about the current juncture we're at? Was it a stone in a teacup, or is there actually some learning we can draw from what happened?
I think the concept of the service couldn't have been better. Reflection, rededication for the future, and prayer. I think it was very unfortunate that through various misunderstandings, perhaps the preparation meant that an opportunity was given, which really was political rather than religious. And I fear that there was a certain degree of harm leading up to the fact, leading up to the controversy you're referring to. But I believe that in a sense was silenced by the fact that the actual service that took place was dignified. It was encompassing various religious groupings, and it spoke of hope. And the involvement of young people during that service was, I think, a healing gesture as much as a prophetic one. And I think that the church leaders are to be commended for going ahead as they did. I think it was unfortunate, but it's often the case of history in Ireland that what was intended to be something can suddenly be misinterpreted by some. I still think it was a real gesture of hope, and I hope people will come to see that.
Lovely. Thank you, Lord Eames. So if you see me busily multitasking, it's because I'm fishing from the abundance of questions we've received. So I'm going to start putting some of them to you now, if I may. So the first one I'll draw upon, because it's a topic you touched on in your intervention, and it's from Hugo McNeil, who I think is known to you, retired international rugby player, outgoing chair of the British Irish Association. And Hugo asks, what are your current thoughts on how to deal with legacy, given your experience on this topic? It's a topic you're particularly versed on, given your work in the Lord. So could you reflect a little bit on how to deal with legacy?
I would have expected a question like that from a good fullback. Legacy is probably the most important issue being looked at the present time, because The British government is proposing legislation which is yet to be seen, which will draw a line in the sand over prosecutions after a certain date. Now that's legalistic, but it is also ignoring the fact that so many people will be denied justice if that is to come to pass. I think of many of the families I've worked with, many of the families I know, who have such hurtful and sad memories of the dark days of the Troubles. They're still looking for justice. One will be asking for knowledge of what happened. Another will be looking at some sense of a link with the past. And yet another will simply want to know what happened. Now that is the source of what I'm saying about reconciliation. And I think the legacy of the past cannot be simply dealt with by signing off legislation or signing off decisions of that nature, but without realizing the sense of human hurt that we're dealing with when we look to the past. I said earlier on that I don't believe we can be dogged by the past. We've got to look forward. But that doesn't mean we lose the lessons of the past. And they're all there. They're there to watch, they're there to see, they're there to analyze. But that doesn't stop us going ahead and looking to the future with hope for a new generation. But I think, Hugo, I would say very simply, you cannot just deal with legacy because you can't change the past. The past happened. I think it's how you interpret the lessons of it that matters.
I've tried to group questions together now, Rodin, just in the interest of time, because there was a flood there in the past couple of minutes. So I'm going to put one question to you that kind of builds on what Hugo just asked. It's about reconciliation from Maggie's Skull. I'll give you that in a moment. But just to prepare you then, I'm going to put two questions to you about the politics of the island of Ireland, if I can call it that. One question about the church, and two questions about life in Northern Ireland. So it's quite ambitious, but I'm going to try and do it as best I can. So the question from Maggie Skull, I'll read it at length. Maggie would like to ask the Archbishop to expand on his own experiences. Maggie knows that he has worked for reconciliation for many years, whether behind the scenes or in presiding over the funerals of those lost to the conflict. How do we account for people's emotions when we think about reconciliation and the future of these islands? What did you turn to in your own life to help you through the darkest days of the Troubles?
That's a searching one. First of all, I have never doubted in my faith journey that there's a purpose for virtually everything you come across. You learn from it. Secondly, people have asked me if my faith suffered because of the experience of the Troubles and what I was dealing with. I have to say, no, it was always there. There were times I asked myself questions that I found very, very difficult to answer. Why? 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 But I think what I turned to most was a personal conviction that what was happening was wrong, what was happening shouldn't be happening. But at the end of the day, there was a God who cared. And if I was to be an advocate for my belief, I should care. And I think, without sounding very noble about it, which I'm certainly not trying to be, that's the reason why pastorally compassion was the center of what I tried to do and tried to be.
The next pair, Lord Eames, I'm going to give pertain to, like, loosely I've said politics on the island of Ireland, but you can judge if that's a fair theme to draw the question first from Professor Niamh Gallagher and then from John Cushnan, who I know is known to you. So Professor Gallagher, Professor of Modern British and Irish History at St. Cat's College in Cambridge. Neil would like to ask the Archbishop, to what extent do you think the use of the term sectarian to describe the conflict in Northern Ireland is actually useful? Neil draws on your relationship with the Archbishop daily, which seems far from sectarian, certainly not indicative of wholesale religious divisions, the usual way in which the conflict is presented. I kind of mashed the question up there a little bit. But to what extent is sectarian still a useful term, or was it ever a useful term? Then from John Cushnan, for our audience, former leader of the Alliance Party and Fine Gael MEP. John says, hello, Robin. Would you agree that the proposed holding of a border poll is premature, and that an absolute essential prerequisite is uniting Northern Ireland first, and evidence that its political institutions are functioning properly in the interest of both sides of Northern Ireland's divided community? So two rather big questions, Lord Eames, but I trust you.
Let me try. First of all, so often we're dismissed in our troubles and in our difficulties as being divided. Oh, it's religion. It's religion. Catholic and Protestant, Protestant and Catholic, and everything else follows from that. I've not fully accepted that. But what I have accepted is that it becomes sectarian when the political element, the political label, is linked inevitably to religious labels. The two, to me, become sectarian, and therefore that is an appropriate word. What I believe is happening and has happened in the past is that it's so easy to dismiss what we have come through as being a religious struggle. And the more I travel the world, more people say to you, oh, you come from that place. It's all about religion, isn't it? I'm tired of hearing that. It's as much about politics as it is about anything else, but politics with a small p. And it's because of the background on both sides of the argument that we still feel people are justified in saying, oh, it's all about religion. Now, to get back to the other question, which is there a border poll? Is there going to be a border poll? When should it be? I want to see issues like that put on a second footing to trying to heal the divisions within the northern part of this island first. Because the Republic of Ireland don't want necessarily to see landed on them responsibility for a community that can't agree among itself. And the people in Northern Ireland certainly don't want to look too far ahead when they think of the divisions that we still encounter, despite the progress we've made in the peace process. And so I would like to think that questions of a border poll, questions of that sort of nature, are not going to be paramount on the list for the future just yet. We have still a lot of healing to do within Northern Ireland.
I'm very, very conscious of time, but I want to kind of tack one thing on each to Professor Gallagher and to John's questions there. To what extent, Robin, do you think the conflict was and is as much about politics, religion, and about inequality as well, kind of socioeconomic factors? Can you comment on that at all?
Very much so. I'm convinced that this division in terms of quality of life, in terms of respect in life, and to get back to my question of consent and its importance, there was this feeling that there was no element of consent on one side, and on the other side, a failure to acknowledge that that consent was a problem for others, is to me one of the real ingredients who have brought us to where we were in the Troubles and what erupted.
Excellent. My question to John Cusnan's question, I'll actually hang on to that until the very end, actually, if I may. So I'll keep on moving. There's a question from Des Atkinson. It's a rather short one. So Des is at the University of Exeter. Good to see you again, Des. Des asks, over recent decades, has the voice and influence of the Church of Ireland been drowned out by that of the other Protestant denominations? And what are the implications if this is the case?
That's a good one. And it's not really for me to comment because I'm so-called retired. But I have always had great confidence in what Anglicanism stood for. The fact that we could have a middle path between divisive or separate parts of the religious picture. I believe that the witness of people in the Church of Ireland has been immense. And I think it far outreaches our numerical strength. Mm-hmm. We have vision in parishes. I've been very, very comforted and proud of what I've seen at the parish level as I've gone about my work. I've seen individual acts of courage, individual acts of reconciliation. And I like to think that we are witnessing to what the basic premise of Anglicanism is, which is we are a Catholic but reformed influence in the whole vista of world religion. And I like to think the Church of Ireland has, and I hope and pray will continue to make that contribution.
Has the nature of the church changed at all over recent years with inward migration, Lord Eames? And not necessarily the composition, but its role in communities. Has this been altered at all by new arrivals?
Well, I think we have. We've had a lot of people coming in from other parts of the world, in Ireland as a whole. But I think what we have changed, and what I've seen changing in my lifetime, has been the way we've expressed our faith in worship. There's been a revolution taking place in traditionalism, particularly I think of it in the Church of Ireland. New ways of worship, new ways of expressing the age-old faith. And I think those of us who are the past generation in many ways have got to have patience. I'm talking about patience in everything, but have patience to understand that our way wasn't necessarily the right way for the present. It may have served in the past, but we've got to be eyes open to new ways of expressing in worship. And to that extent, we have changed.
Wonderful. Professor Bugini, there's two short questions I'm going to put Lord Eames, and then I might go back to you in case you want to respond to anything that he said, if that's all right. So the first question comes from John Cartledge. So I laugh because John is a diehard attendee at our meetings. It's good to see you, John. I think you might have the honor of being at all of them. So thanks for coming, John. And John asks a very pertinent question that he has asked before. It links a small bit to some of the things you said already, Lord Eames. John asks, what part does denominational education play in the perpetuation of tribal attitudes in Northern Ireland? Given that such discrimination is now outlawed in most other areas of public life, why is it still tolerated in the education sector?
I would speak from practical experience in this case. I have found in many of the grammar school sector in Northern Ireland a mixing of backgrounds which wouldn't have been present in my days at school. I think of my old school, Methodist College in Belfast, where there is a substantial input now from various backgrounds, various religious labels. And I think this is a wonderful expression of hope for the future. Again, it gets away from the labeling that I was attacking earlier on. It gets away from the idea that you can have divisions in the early years of a young person's life, and learning what other people think, learning what other backgrounds speak from, cannot but be good and bring about positive reaction.
The penultimate question, or the last question I'll put to you before going back to you, Genio, is from Gareth Fitzgerald, Lord Eames. And Gareth asks, it's something we spoke about, you and I, Robin, before the event began. Given the happy All Blacks events of this last weekend, Ireland beating New Zealand in a triumphant performance on Saturday afternoon, To what degree do you think sport can play an important role in healing division or enforcing change? Rugby in Ireland during the Troubles and in apartheid South Africa serve as examples. Sports differ in Ireland as to whether they represent the island or the distinct political entities.
Sport is one of the greatest binders and formation of friendship that I know. I'm totally committed to that. I think some of the happiest memories that I have from my youth were meeting people who would come from a totally different background to me, but because we were leveled in the field of sport, it was something wonderful. And those friendships, I'm glad to say, still exist. But to take the wider part of the question, I believe sport has been and will continue to be, even through the Troubles, one of the best levelers in our society. And I think no trouble is too great to encourage that in the future.
Professor Bigini, before I hand back to you, just in the interest of fairness, I always ask people if they could put their questions in early because I'm a terrible multitasker, but in the interest of balance, there is just one last question I want to put to the Lord Eames, and we have the time. It comes from Kenneth Wilson. Lord Eames, Kenneth Wilson says, the Archbishop says it's not primarily a religious issue, it's a political one. Yet your discourse is deeply religious. Is it possible that the religious nature of the discourse is a problem to such an extent that it should now be excluded from politics?
I like to distinguish between religion and faith. I think if I've given the impression that religion is the only thing that I'm talking about, then I've failed. I believe you can have deep faith, deep personal faith. And that is what I believe has shone out in people that I have come to know, people that I've appreciated. And yet religious can so often just be the label, the denominational label. And unfortunately, in our legacy, too often the political label. And so I'm making no apology for having spoken of the spiritual side and the faith side of what I call experience.
Thank you so much, Lord Eames. We really appreciate all the thoughtful questions from the whole range of people we get. So we really appreciate your honesty and fairness in answering all the questions we put to you, Lord Eames. Professor Bigini, do you have any response to the questions you'd like to know?
Yes. Speaking of the spiritual side, there have been developments in the churches, not just in Northern Ireland, but worldwide, which have generated new divisions, particularly with reference to attitudes to sexuality. And these divisions are bitter and to the point of breaking old friendships and in some cases threatening the unity of institutions or churches which have been together for centuries. What is your view, I mean, not on specific issues, but what is your view about this area of reconciliation, which is of course one for the divide between the North, which tends to be more conservative, and the Republic, which now tends to be much more liberal?
To give value to what you ask is to take us into so many fields, so many facets. There will always be separate thoughts about such things as gender issues, such things as sexuality. That brings us into the question of morality, the question of how you frame moral values, how you frame moral issues, and how you approach them. The churches struggle over some of the developments in human relationships. And yet, isn't it surprising as we look to church history, how often after a period of divisive discussion, we come to some sort of agreement how to approach them? And I go back, Professor, if I may, to what I tried to say earlier on. To me, more important than structures, more important than individual outlook, is the value of persons, person. people will change in attitude. People will hold different values. The Christ that I try to follow didn't separate people because of just their religion or their political outlook, but he saw people as people who needed compassion, understanding, and dare I mention it again, the ability to listen. And I think what we're learning in the churches is that sometimes we've been too quick to speak and too slow to listen.
Thank you.
Are you happy, Professor?
Oh yes, it's a very important issue, but we cannot exhaust it in the last few minutes, which we have left to ourselves.
No, indeed. So then it's just up to me to, I guess, just to make a couple of closing remarks, that these meetings, we are very happy and very proud that they're open to the public, and we attract a wide range of people, some people with deep understanding and familiarity with the topics we're discussing, and people who are coming with less understanding, familiarity, awareness, and baggage. And I think you made, Lord Eames, you made a really wonderful presentation from your depth of experience about life in the island of Ireland, some of the challenges, but also you leave us with some reasons for hope, for sure. And also, I think one of the things that I've always tried to discuss with colleagues, especially in the UK, where I've spent a lot of my kind of recent years, or the past 10 years, is that Northern Ireland isn't this kind of homogeneous place where there's the two sides. There's Catholics and there's Protestants, and that's it. Obviously, it's a place of great heterogeneity and great subtlety. And even within the faith community, there's a great abundance and a great richness between the different groups that there are in Northern Ireland. So I think you did a wonderful job of kind of highlighting that and bringing attention to it. Just to make a quick remark about our next meetings in the series, that next week we're delighted to be hosting Matt Carty TD, Sinn Féin TD for Calvin Monaghan. The following week we'll have Ivana Bacik, who's the Labour TD for Dublin Bay South. And then on our last meeting before Christmas, on the 6th of December, we're going to host Doug Beattie, who's the MLA for, oh goodness, I believe Upper Ban, forgive me, but the leader of the UUP. It is Upper Ban, isn't it?
I think so.
A long day. But anyway, Doug and the rest of the speakers, we're absolutely delighted to have this kind of great range of speakers, and we really appreciate, Lord Eames, you taking the time to be with us and for speaking so honestly and so candidly. And that's just up to me to thank you and to wish you well. Professor BG, do you want to make any final remarks?
And thank you for all of you who have taken part in this webinar this evening.
Indeed. For anyone who missed any of the meetings, as I've always said, the recordings are available on our website, which I'd shared in the chat if you search the Cambridge Seminar on the Future of the Island of Ireland. So thank you again to our sponsors. Thank you to Lord Eames, and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.